Upon the realms of the primes, life was flourishing. As the magic levels began to rise, creatures long slumbering began to wake, and the return of many magical creatures began. Old races appeared across the realms. Some had been slumbering for millennia, while others walked back to the primes from pocket realms from where they had been waiting in stasis. It was a very strange time for some primes. Old paths to distant dormant planes also began to be opened, and with that the primes regained vast numbers of their populace that had been forced to leave in the times past. Thalassiac welcomed those whom he saw warmly, as some were ancient and knew of him, and some had even met him in their early existence. He was happy that the magic had returned, and this could only be a good thing. Upon some primes, the thunderous roars of long-lost beasts could be heard, behemoths towering 30 or more feet above the normal occupants of such. For the most part, they were neutral in temperament, but in some cases it sparked the resurgence of creatures of pure evil, and this had been a risk they needed to take. Chrylsis had set his sights and entrusted the primes to be able to handle the resurgences of these prime evils, ancient and deadly. But in some cases their outlooks had changed with their separation from other life for so long. For some, it merely sparked a longing to feast for the first time in a myriad of centuries. Eggs, and some bodies long assumed dead, in old collections and ruins or buried deep in the caves of fallen places, began to gather and energize as the astral began breathing life back into them. As the levels rose, hatchlings of ancient beasts emerged throughout the realms, marking the first of their kinds to be born in the new age of magic. They would herald in the return of the astral and all its glory, and coupled with other returns, things did indeed seem to be far for the better overall. However, it also became vastly more complicated. Long-missing creatures on some primes seen as myth and legend returned swiftly, and their arrival sparked holy quests, militant moves and crusades against their kinds, all set about by admiration, embracing, or outright fear of their return. And with these issues, some returning creatures were brought to the folds of their seekers, others were put to the blade, and their bodies worn as trophies or used in magical rituals or crafting. Barbarism rose upon many primes, as the return of such also meant the return of the old ways for many. Some primes became overrun by their new denizens, quickly becoming outnumbered or simply outbattled. These primes became dark places, where conflict and war was a new way of existence, where their new dark lords had returned to bring back their old way and rule. These primes sought to seek out other primes and enforce their power upon them. Some in particular only saw the other primes as new places for conquest, while others saw them as places for more sacrifice or magical ingredients in the form of the emerging creatures that their realms did not possess. So began the age of conflict. As old enemies returned, enmities came with them. Vengeful tyrants rose from the ashes of enemies long past, blood still on their souls for the wars of long forgotten times, and this became the start of the first prime war, as the powers of an ancient god returned, only to find their god had long been lost to their prime, and so they sought to take a new one for their own, by removing followers from another prime in vast numbers, and like a band of slavers, huge forces of creatures invaded other primes, stealing away many priests from differing places, to bring back the gods of their own. These efforts worked, and they petitioned the gods once present to return their old gods. Some were returned as they merely slumbered, but some had been obliterated at the hands of the Nameless One, and this angered them greatly, for as they saw it, a god had slain their own, and now walked among the daemons. They would find this daemon god and destroy it. And so the first folly to come from the return of the age of magic began, the search for the Nameless One himself. One of the primes spearheaded this move, for the skin of the Astra was malleable from their prime, and as they were not of demon kind, they could pass through it with relative ease. They entered it and began to map out the paths and waypoints to other primes, to other planes, and eventually to a demonic realm. This is where they became the first prime to invade the demonic planes, much to the shock and surprise of the Overlord who presided over it. The prime force was repelled, but not without a large loss on the daemons' side. Chrylsis saw what was transpiring, and for a time welcomed this striking back against them, but quickly realized this was something they must stop when demons from that plane poured through the gateway they had made, and began the first true incursion upon the primes since the astral had been established. If a prime opened a portal to the planes, then the barrier was already pierced, and this meant that the demons could not touch the astral, and hence could not be repelled by such. Damned fools, he thought, as he watched those of the prime die in their droves defending this gateway, as this daemon pushed much power through as he could, before it withdrew, satiated from the souls it had taken, and its newfound knowledge, a weakness in the astral barriers. Chrylsis sent word to the hosts, and they passed the information to their followers, and in turn to those of the realms. Practice of demonology became an outlawed practice upon many primes, as the threat was simply too great. But this merely sped some primes' magic users on, to abuse this knowledge and forge extremely powerful alliances with demonic beings from the planes beyond. Upon the prime that held Lassashar, the pantheon of Dominion was approached by their demonologist allies, who had once aided them in the creation of their vessel. They asked that they be allowed to continue to practice, but they denied them their request. They told them the reasons of the Nameless One being able to use this to penetrate and assault this prime. They understood, but they were bitter at the denial of their magical heritage. But perhaps that was needed. Perhaps it could be used to draw him in, and the weapon they had created with Thalassiac finally be used against him. This could mean an end to the threat, and the allowance of the demonologists to continue their old ways. After deliberation, the Dominion gods told those who had petitioned them to be allowed to pierce the astral, and they were eager to see this plan work. However, although they had eventually agreed to the idea, some had ignored the warnings before their agreement, and took the risks they deemed were acceptable. Eventually, a weaver of the dark arts whose name was lost to time itself did pierce the veil, and deliberately left a tether open, albeit a small one, that went unnoticed for thousands of years. They were happy with their success, and their act of defiance would eventually doom their prime, although this may have actually been their true intent. It was even said that this weaver had intended for such a tether to be created, to seed the return of him, but none could truly know, as they were seemingly wiped from existence, and all trace of them being removed from all. The only thing that was ever discovered about this tether, or the identity of the creator, was that of a strange cloak that appeared undamaged by the passage of time. It was made of fine dark scales, laying where the ritual of anchoring of the tether would have been conducted, and it was of an unknown origin. There was also no trace of what would have worn the robe, not even dust within it. The entire area was devoid of any debris, in fact. Unfortunately, the one who found it was not an agent of the gods in defense of this prime. It would be an agent of his, the Nameless. Thalassiac agreed to the testing, or rather the proving of his machinations, and requested that the demonologist open a portal to a specific place that he provided the components for. They agreed, and waited for his command. Of course, he made sure his pawns were in place with an envoy, sent to Temeran. Temeran mobilized immediately, heading to where he had been told his quarry would be, apparently opening a vast portal to an unknown place. Upon arrival, he discovered a vast portal, tens of feet across, with inscriptions upon the ground, and around the edge of it stood Nightstalker, padding slowly, seemingly pulling magic from the circle. The demonologists had done as they were asked, and set the ritual in motion. The presence of Nightstalker caused the portal to begin to open, as it had been engineered. And as Nightstalker watched and tried to divine where it was going, Temeran charged in, and their fight began. The fight lasted for a long time, and as the portal slowly opened, they were both bathed in vast energies, empowering them both. Their vigor and blows increasing, they both realized this portal was somehow energizing them, and both tried to use it to their advantage, and this was when Temeran finally struck a decisive blow against his foe. Stalker lay in the circle, his power still rising but crippled from the strike of his adversary. He could sense Thalassiac watching him and asked him simply, "Is this it? Did I fail?" Thalassiac simply replied with, "You are right where you need to be." Temeran stood over him and raised his sword high, bringing it down upon his brow, and that was the last thing he remembered, at least for a time. All Temeran saw was a flash of black light, and he too remembered nothing until he came round to find himself and his adversary drained of power and unable to fight. "What did you do?" he said weakly to Stalker, as he tried to bring himself to his feet. You did this," Stalker hissed at him, dragging himself towards the darkness of the area. They were both wrong, and as they retreated, insults and promises whispered and sworn under the breaths across the winds of magic, Thalassiac smiled. "Well done, puppets, well done indeed." And he left the place that was the first proof of his plans. They had won their first battle against him, even if they knew nothing of the fact.